We're taking a look at Dan Zahavi's Self-Awareness and Alterity, a pretty dense but fascinating phenomenological investigation. And at its heart, it's about how consciousness, how we as individuals are aware of ourselves, and then, importantly, how that self-awareness ties into, like, gets tangled up with our experience of everything and everyone else, that otherness Zahavi calls alterity.
So Zahavi starts off by noting that self-awareness is a very ambiguous concept.
Yes.
And it's used in many different contexts in philosophy and psychology.
Yeah, and in this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on the phenomenon of self-awareness. And by that, I mean how consciousness experiences and is given to itself.
Right, so not so much personal identity or the mind-body problem. We're not really going to be looking at the empirical genesis of self-awareness or its epistemic or transcendental significance. We're really going to be focusing on just the phenomenon itself.
And that's what the aim of the book is as well. It's to investigate self-awareness and to ultimately clarify the relationship between self-awareness and alterity or otherness.
Okay, so how does he go about doing this?
Well, he adopts a phenomenological approach, and he focuses in particular on Husserl's theory of self-awareness, but he also draws on other phenomenological thinkers. And he really wants to show that phenomenology has made a significant contribution to understanding self-awareness, a contribution that deserves much more recognition in contemporary discussion.
So the central question, then, that Zahavi's book addresses is, can self-manifestation occur without heteromanifestation and without a relation to another self, or to oneself as another?
Yes, that's the core question of the book. Zahavi looks at the unique logical status of the first-person pronoun I.
Okay.
And he draws on the work of Castaneda,
Okay.
who argues that I belongs to a distinct category that is fundamentally different from both third-person pronouns and from demonstratives.
Right, so different from he, she, it, and also different from this and that?
Yes. I, he says, functions as a pure indexical term. And that means that the use of I guarantees the existence and the immediate experiential presence of the speaker.
Right. Okay.
So when I say I'm hungry,
Yeah.
then the use of I guarantees that I exist and that I'm experiencing this hunger right now.
Yeah, and that's different from a demonstrative, like if I say this is heavy, because if I'm pointing to an empty space, I'm not actually referring to anything that's heavy.
And so Castaneda claims that to be self-aware means that you have to dispense with any third-person reference to yourself. So if you want to think about yourself as yourself, you can't think of yourself as he or she.
Right.
And he illustrates this point by introducing this notation of he, which stands for the he of self-consciousness,
Okay.
and which he says can only be adequately replaced by I.
So he's trying to capture that difference between the subject and the object.
Yes, exactly.
That we were talking about before.
Yes.
Okay.
And Zahavi brings up Perry's example of the messy shopper,
Okay.
which is a well-known example in philosophy,
Yeah, right.
and it illustrates this point.
Yeah, so in this example, someone's walking down the grocery store aisle
Yes.
and knocking things off the shelves, and they have a description of this person as being really messy and knocking everything down.
Right.
But that's all they have is that third-person description, and then suddenly they realize, oh, I am that person.
Yes.
And then it's like a totally different realization from just that person is messy.
And the point here is that you can have all kinds of third-person descriptions of yourself, but that doesn't necessitate the realization that I am that person.
Yeah, and this is also really important for agency.
And this shows us that self-awareness isn't just some epiphenomenon
Right.
that doesn't really have any impact on how we act,
Yeah.
but is actually an important part of practical reasoning and agency.
Okay, so the takeaway from this chapter is that I functions in a fundamentally different way from third-person references. And that a theory of self-awareness can't just be derived from models of how we become aware of objects.
And so he says that a minimal demand on a proper theory of self-awareness is that it has to be able to explain the peculiar features of the first-person pronoun I, and it has to preserve the difference between first-person and third-person reference.
Okay, so if a theory can't do those two things, it's not really an adequate theory of self-awareness. So that leads us to chapter 2, reflective versus pre-reflective self-awareness.
Yes.
So this is a really important chapter because it addresses a central problem in understanding how we become aware of ourselves.
Yes. And Zahavi begins by looking at this so-called reflection theory of self-awareness, which says that we become aware of our own mental states by reflecting on them.
Right. So I have a thought, and then I reflect on that thought, and that's how I become self-aware.
Exactly. But there's a problem with this theory.
And the problem is?
Well, it either leads to an infinite regress or to a kind of circularity.
Okay. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, if every act of self-awareness requires a prior act of reflection, Then we end up with an infinite number of reflections.
So to become aware of my thought, I first have to reflect on it. But then to become aware of that reflection, I have to reflect on that reflection.
So it never ends.
Right, okay. I see how that's a problem.
The other possibility is that it's circular.
Meaning?
Well, if we say that self-awareness is based on reflection, then how can we reflect on our mental states without already being self-aware?
Yeah, so it's like the theory is presupposing the very thing that is trying to explain. It's already assuming that we're self-aware in order for us to reflect and become self-aware.
Yes. And so, because of this problem, thinkers like Henrich and Frank, for example, argue that we need to accept that there's a more basic form of self-awareness that is not based on reflection.
Okay.
That is what they call pre-reflective self-awareness.
Okay, so we have this distinction between reflective, which is sort of secondary, and then pre-reflective, which is more primordial.
And Frank's direct argument for this pre-reflective self-awareness is that experience is always given in a first-person perspective.
Okay.
So while the objects of our perception are accessible to everyone, the experience itself is uniquely given to the subject who's undergoing that experience.
So the objects of our perception are intersubjectively available, but the subjective experience is essentially private. Okay, I think I'm starting to see where this is going. So when I'm seeing a tree, for example,
Yes.
well, anyone can see that tree, but my particular experience of seeing that tree is only available to me.
That's what he calls the subjectivity of experience.
Okay.
So subjectivity is the unique feel, or what it is like, of an experience.
Right, okay.
It's the fact that there is something it is like for me to see the tree that distinguishes my experience from the tree itself, which can be observed by everyone.
Right, so this gets at the famous what is it like to be a bat question. We can describe bat sonar
Yes.
in objective terms.
Yeah.
But we can't really know what it's like to experience the world through bat sonar.
And this is what McGinn calls the Janus-faced nature of perceptual experience.
What does he mean by that?
Well, on the one hand, experience is directed outwards towards the world. So it's of an object, in this case, the tree.
Right.
But on the other hand, experience also presents a subjective face to the subject.
Okay.
So there's also something it is like for me to experience this tree. And McGinn argues that these two faces of experience are interconnected. So what the experience is like is a function of what it is, and vice versa.
So the way I experience the tree is going to be shaped by the fact that it is tree, and the fact that it is a tree is going to shape what it is like for me to experience it?
Yes. So we've talked about Frank's direct argument for pre-reflective self-awareness.
Right.
But there's also a transcendental argument for this,
Okay.
which draws on thinkers like Fick. And it basically says that our awareness of objects presupposes self-awareness.
So in order for me to be aware of that tree out there, I first have to be self-aware.
So self-awareness is a condition of possibility for object consciousness.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, in order to be conscious of anything, you have to be the subject of that experience.
Oh, okay.
And to be the subject of experience means to be self-aware.
Right, so to be aware of the tree, I have to be aware of myself as the one seeing the tree. I think this is where the indexical arguments for pre-reflective self-awareness come in.
So contemporary philosophers like Shoemaker, Chisholm, and Tugendhat have all argued that the I functions as a kind of anchor for our entire system of reference.
Okay.
So in order for me to refer to anything in the world, whether demonstratively or perceptually, I first had to be aware of my own position in relation to that thing.
Okay, so if I say, that tree over there, I'm implicitly aware of myself as being here and the tree as being over there.
And even perception can be seen as an indexical form of experience. So Smith, for example, says that when we perceive an object, we perceive it as actually now here sensuously before me.
Right.
So perception has this immediate presentational character to it, and this implies a minimal form of self-awareness.
So just to be clear, even though we're talking about pre-reflective self-awareness, we're not saying that there's no self-awareness involved in perception.
Right.
There's still a minimal tacit self-awareness.
Yes. So Zahavi distinguishes between pre-reflective self-awareness, which is immediate, implicit, irrelational, non-objectifying, non-conceptual, non-propositional self-acquaintance on the one hand, and reflective self-awareness on the other hand, which is an explicit, relational, mediated, conceptual, objectifying thematization of consciousness.
So reflective self-awareness is when I actually think about myself as an object of thought, whereas pre-reflective self-awareness is just this background awareness that I have of myself in every experience.
And Frank says that consciousness is originally given as a single unit that is not divided into a subject and an object. And so this leads to two contrasting models of consciousness.
Okay.
On the one hand, there's this view that consciousness is just consciousness of the intentional object,
Right.
and that self-awareness only arises through a subsequent act of reflection.
So it's like consciousness is like a knife that can cut other things, but it can't cut itself?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there's the view that consciousness is already self-aware in its very act of being aware of objects.
So it's like consciousness is more like a flame. It illuminates both its surroundings and itself.
Yes. And so this leads to a debate about whether self-awareness is subjectless or egoless, or whether it's egological.
Okay.
So the egological view is that every experience involves a subject,
Okay.
an I, that
Yeah.
is the bearer of that experience.
So this is the classic ego cogitatum structure.
But the Heidelberg School, so Henrich and Frank in particular, criticize this egological view. And they say that it already presupposes a kind of reflection, because they say that if you have to use the word I in order to describe self-awareness, then you're already reflecting on yourself.
Right.
And so they say that original self-awareness is strictly irrelational.
Meaning.
It doesn't involve any kind of relation between a subject and an object.
Okay, so it's just pure experience. Okay.
But it's interesting to note that both Henrich and Frank later acknowledge that self-awareness is actually more complex than they initially thought.
Okay, so they revise their view.
Yes.
How so?
Well, they say that self-awareness can manifest itself in a variety of ways.
Okay.
So they talk about anonymous subjectivity, they talk about epistemic self-acquaintance, and they talk about egological organization.
And I guess this makes sense, right? Because we're talking about a whole spectrum of self-awareness.
So he's saying there's a more basic fundamental level of self-awareness that's happening even before we start reflecting on our experiences.
Yeah, it's there in the background, so to speak. And he's not alone in this. Henrich and Frank were also big on this idea of a more immediate, implicit form of self-awareness.
It makes sense, right? If I can later think about an experience, that experience must have already been mine in some way to begin with.
Precisely. So how does Zahavi argue for this pre-reflective self-awareness? Well, he focuses on this idea of the first personal givenness of experience.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So think about it like this. When I experience something, like that beautiful sunset, it's given directly to me. It's subjective. It's my experience.
Whereas the actual sunset, anyone can see it. It's out there. It's objective. It's not tied to any one person.
Zahavi connects this back to Nagel's famous what it is like argument, that idea that being conscious means there's a certain feeling, a qualitative aspect to experience, and that feeling is inherently subjective. It's tied to the subject having the experience.
So there's something it feels like to be me watching that sunset.
Right. And you can't ask that what it is like question about a rock or a chair. They're not having experiences.
I see. So the fact that we have subjective experiences, that there's something it feels like to be us, points to this underlying pre-reflective self-awareness.
Right. Zahavi also uses this idea of indexicality to support pre-reflective self-awareness. He borrows from Smith, who talks about how our perception presents things as actually now here, sensuously before me. And Smith argues that being able to grasp something in this way in relation to ourselves requires a basic implicit self-awareness. We know where something is in relation to us because we have this implicit sense of ourselves as the one perceiving.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like I can't understand in front of me if I don't have some sense of me to begin with.
Zahavi even digs into Fichte's work, which adds another layer to this. Fichte's argument is all about how our ability to focus on objects, to have intentions towards things in the world, actually requires self-awareness as a foundation.
So if I can pay attention to that tree without needing to simultaneously think, oh, hey, I'm paying attention to a tree, there's got to be some level of self-awareness already happening beneath the surface, allowing that focus to occur.
Right. Fichte would say the I is like this anchor for our entire experience of the world. It's the reference point that allows us to make sense of everything else.
So we've got this pre-reflective self-awareness happening all the time. But how is it different from like regular thinking about myself self-awareness?
Zahavi's really clear about this distinction. Pre-reflective self-awareness is immediate. It's there without us having to do anything. It's implicit. It's not something we're actively thinking about.
And it's irrelational. It's not about comparing ourselves to others or seeing ourselves as an object.
No.
It's non-objectifying. We're not turning our awareness into a thing.
And it's non-conceptual. It's not tied to specific ideas or thoughts about ourselves. And finally, it's non-propositional. It's not like making a statement about ourselves.
So it's almost like this background hum of self-awareness Always there, but not in the spotlight.
Exactly. And that's totally different from reflective self-awareness, the kind where we're actively thinking about ourselves, analyzing our thoughts and feelings.
Reflective awareness is like, okay, let me examine myself, my motivations. Who am I? It's deliberate, it's focused, it's conceptual.
And crucially, it depends on that pre-reflective self-awareness, that underlying sense of me that's already there. You can't analyze something that doesn't exist in the first place.
Okay, so we've got Zahavi's take on pre-reflective self-awareness. Now, how does Husserl fit into all this?
Right. Well, some folks criticize Husserl. They say he was too focused on object intentionality.
Meaning, consciousness is always about something, it's always directed at an object.
Yeah. And those critics say Husserl never really broke free from that reflection theory we talked about earlier.
But Zahavi, he's like, hold up, there's more to Husserl than that. He points to Husserl's work on passivity and temporality. These show us there's more to subjectivity than just being about objects.
Even Sartre, who had his own beef with Husserl sometimes, admitted that Husserl had some pretty insightful things to say about this pre-reflective level of consciousness.
So Zahavi's trying to clear Husserl's name, so to speak. He's saying, look, Husserl actually had a pretty solid grasp on this pre-reflective self-awareness stuff.
Yeah. For Husserl, it's about this originary self-appearance, this way that consciousness shows up to itself right from the start.
And Zahavi clarifies, this isn't about actively grabbing onto ourselves like, aha, there I am. It's more fundamental than that.
Yeah. It's just there, like something being leibhaftig, actually present and alive in our experience.
Husserl does sometimes talk about inner perception. But Zahavi says, don't get hung up on the word perception. It's not like we're turning our awareness into an object and looking at it.
It's about that immediacy, that directness of self-givenness. We're not perceiving ourselves, we're just there, aware.
Okay, this is where things get even more complex, but also more interesting. Zahavi dives deep into how time and self-awareness are intertwined.
Oh yeah. He borrows heavily from Husserl's work on inner time consciousness. Basically how we experience time from the inside.
So not just clock time, but our lived experience of the past, present, and future.
Exactly. And Zahavi, bringing in Derrida here, argues that every single self-aware experience has this irreducible alterity of the past built into it.
Meaning the past isn't just gone, it's somehow still present in our current experience.
It's part of the very fabric of our awareness. And this is where Husserl's ideas about retention, pretension, and primal impression come into play.
Okay, I'm gonna need you to break those down for me.
Sure. So retention is like this immediate holding on to of the just past. It's how we experience the present moment as flowing from the past. Pretension is the flip side. It's our anticipation of what's coming next, the immediate future.
And the primal impression is the now part.
Yeah, the core of the present moment. But Husserl says even the primal impression is fleeting. It's constantly slipping away. So even in that now moment, there's already a bit of the past mixed in.
Whoa, my brain is bending a bit here.
It's deep stuff. But the point is, even our most basic experience of ourselves, of being self-aware, already has this element of otherness baked into it. The past is always there, shaping the present.
So we're not just static, unchanging selves. We're constantly becoming built up from this flow of time and experience.
Right. And Zahavi contrasts this with Henry's idea of self-awareness. Henry thought there was this primary level of self-manifestation that's totally outside of time.
Wait, outside of time? How's that even possible?
Yeah. Well, for Henry, this is the most basic way consciousness shows up to itself. It's non-ecstatic, meaning it's not reaching out to anything else. It's completely self-contained, pure self-presence.
So no past, no future, just this pure now of self-awareness.
Right. It's a pure self-affection, totally immanent, nothing outside of itself.
That's so different from Husserl's view, where even the present moment is this complex interplay of past, present, and future.
Huge difference. For Husserl, everything's in flux, everything's dynamic. For Henry, there's this core of pure self-presence that's unchanging.
Fascinating, these different perspectives. But Zahavi doesn't stop there. He also brings in the body, how our lived physical experience is part of this whole self-awareness thing.
Right, the lived body, the libe. Zahavi says our awareness of our bodies is totally bound up with our perception of the world around us. He calls it heteroaffection, affection from the other.
So it's not just that I'm aware of my body separately from the world. My experience of my body is shaped by my interactions with everything else.
And a classic example of this is double sensation. You know, when you touch one hand with the other. It's weird because you're both the toucher and the touched. It's this perfect example of how self and other are intertwined, even within our own bodies.
So I'm experiencing myself as both subject and object at the same time.
And Zahavi argues this kind of internal otherness, this experiencing ourselves as both self and other, helps us understand other people, other embodied subjects.
It's like our own bodies give us a blueprint for empathy, for understanding what it's like to be another person in the world.
Pretty profound, right? So all of this brings us to Zahavi's central thesis. You can't have self-awareness without alterity. They're two sides of the same coin.
So it's not enough to just be aware of myself. I become self-aware through my relationship with everything that's not myself.
Exactly. Zahavi calls it self-manifestation when consciousness shows up to itself, but he says this is always accompanied by hetero-manifestation, how other things show up to consciousness.
And he even brings Sartre into this, right? Sartre was all about how consciousness is constantly transcending itself, reaching out towards something beyond itself.
Yeah, for Sartre, consciousness is empty on its own. It only gains content and even awareness of itself through its relationship with things outside itself.
So it's like I'm not just stuck inside my own head. My awareness is always directed outwards, engaging with the world with other people. And that's what makes me self-aware.
Right. And that act of engaging, of distinguishing myself from what I'm experiencing, that's what creates my sense of self, according to Sartre.
Like, I am not the tree, I am not the sunset, I am not the other person, therefore I am.
Pretty radical, all right. But Zahavi, while he agrees that alterity is essential for self-awareness, he's a little cautious about going full Sartre on this. Well, some thinkers take this even further and say that self-awareness isn't just accompanied by alterity, it's actually created by it. Like, our sense of self is totally dissolved into this play of differences, of otherness.
So I only exist because I'm different from everything else.
Yeah, something like that. And while Zahavi acknowledges the role of otherness, especially in how we experience time, he's not ready to throw out the idea of a core self altogether.
So he's walking a tightrope here. He's saying, yes, alterity is crucial, but there's still something unique and important about the I, about that individual experiencing self-awareness.
And this is where Derrida's ideas come in handy, specifically about how retention shapes the primal impression. It's like even our most basic experience of the present moment is already colored by the past, by that other that's no longer present.
So even that core self-awareness has this inherent dynamism, this movement. It's not just static.
And this is where Zahavi gets really nuanced. He starts talking about different levels of egocentricity within self-awareness.
Levels of being self-centered.
Well, not quite in the everyday sense. He's talking about different ways the I shows up in our experience.
Okay, so what are these levels?
He talks about formal egocentricity. This is the most basic. It's just the idea that the I is the center of all experience. Then there's act transcendent egocentricity, which is about how the I persists over time. It's the sense of me that continues through all my different experiences.
So even though I'm constantly changing, experiencing new things, there's still this underlying me that's holding it all together.
Right. And finally, there's worldly self-awareness, which is about the I as a being in the world interacting with other things and other people.
So it's like zooming out from the most basic sense of I as the center of experience to I as this enduring self, to I as a being in the world.
And all these levels have that potential for relationship with otherness baked in. It's like as the I expands outwards, so does its potential for connection with what's not I.
This all leads to that big question. How does self-awareness shape our experience of other people?
Right. And Zahavi's clear. Encountering another person, that's a whole different kind of alterity. It's not like the alterity of the past or the alterity of a tree or a rock.
It's like another person's looking back at me. They have their own experiences, their own self-awareness.
And Zahavi brings in Levinas here. Levinas was all about the radical otherness of the other, the idea that another person is fundamentally different from me. They can't be reduced to my understanding.
So it's not just about understanding someone else's perspective. It's about recognizing that there's a limit to that understanding. There's always something that escapes my grasp.
Right. And this encounter with the other, with its radical alterity, actually has ethical implications, according to Levinas. It calls me to respond, to acknowledge this otherness.
So our relationship with other people isn't just about knowing them. It's about how we treat them, how we respond to their existence.
And for Zahavi, this all ties back to his core thesis. He argues that self-awareness, even at that most basic level, that pre-reflective self-affection, is always open to alterity. It's always reaching out, connecting, transcending itself.
It's like even that core I isn't some closed-off, isolated thing. It's inherently relational. It exists in relationship to the world, to other people.
It's a movement of perpetual self-transcendence, as Zahavi puts it, and that's the essence of the cogito, I think. It's not just about thinking, it's about being open, vulnerable, connected to what's beyond itself.
Wow, okay, I'm feeling pretty mind blown at this point, but we're not quite done yet. Zahavi also tackles this tricky question of the unconscious.
Oh yeah, the big Freudian elephant in the room. How can we have this inherent self-awareness, this always already knowing of ourselves, if there's a whole unconscious realm operating beneath the surface?
Right. Does Freud blow Zahavi's whole argument out of the water?
Not exactly. Zahavi actually takes issue with certain interpretations of the unconscious, especially those that talk about fully fledged unconscious thoughts and feelings.
So like having an unconscious desire? That's just like a conscious desire, but hidden.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Zahavi says, hold on, if we take the first personal nature of experience seriously, then it doesn't really make sense to talk about truly unconscious experiences.
Because if I'm not aware of it, if it's not given to me in that first-person way, can it really be an experience at all?
He uses the example of pain. What would it even mean to have an unconscious pain? Pain, by its very nature, is something that's felt, that's experienced.
Right, unfelt pain is like a square circle. It doesn't really make sense.
And Zahavi acknowledges that we do have habits, dispositions, maybe even some cognitive processes that operate outside of our immediate awareness. But he's skeptical of the idea that these are full-blown experiences in the same way as conscious ones.
So instead of thinking of the unconscious as this separate realm of thoughts and feelings, maybe it's more about those aspects of our experience that are pre-reflective, that are there but not in the spotlight of our attention.
It's like they're part of our conscious field, but we're not focusing on them right now. They have the potential to become conscious, but they're not fully formed experiences yet.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So after this deep dive into Zahavi, what's the takeaway? What's that central thesis he's trying to get across?
The big takeaway is that self-awareness is inherently relational. It's not something we have in isolation. It emerges from our connection with the world, with other people, with everything that's not ourselves.
It's not just about looking inward. It's about that constant interplay between self and other.
And even at its most basic level, that pre-reflective self-awareness, it has this inherent openness to alterity. It's always reaching out, transcending itself.
So maybe instead of thinking of the self as this solid, unchanging thing, we should see it as a process, a constant becoming, shaped by our relationships and interactions.
And that's what makes Zahavi's work so interesting. It challenges us to rethink what it means to be a self, to be aware, to exist in the world.
Absolutely. And there are so many fascinating threads to pull on here, like that whole discussion of the pronoun I, how it's doing something totally unique compared to other words.
Yeah, and the idea that our perception of the world is always from a point of view, that there's always that implicit I in the background.
And then there's that double sensation example, how even our own bodies give us this experience of self and other intertwined.
It's all about seeing those connections, recognizing how self and other are constantly shaping each other.
So to leave our listeners with something to ponder, what if we take this idea of inherent openness to its logical conclusion? What if our very identity, who we are, is constantly being shaped by our encounters with what's not us?
What if the self isn't a fixed entity, but this ongoing process of engagement and transformation? It really challenges our traditional notions of individuality and makes you think about the interconnectedness of everything.
Food for thought, right? Maybe the self isn't something we discover, but something we create, something that emerges from our relationships with the world around us.
So to sum up, we've covered a lot of ground in these first few chapters.
We've seen the difference between I as subject and I as object, the distinction between reflective and pre-reflective self-awareness.
And all the challenges involved in trying to understand this fundamental aspect of our being.
And Husserl's phenomenological approach seems to offer a promising path for further exploration.
Especially his emphasis on the connection between self-awareness, time, and embodiment.
Right, there's a lot more to unpack there.
But hopefully you now have a good grasp of the basic questions that phenomenology is trying to address.
And as a final thought, consider this. How is your pre-reflective awareness shaping your experience of this very podcast right now?
Interesting.
Even without explicitly thinking about it, you're aware of the sounds, the feelings, the thoughts arising in your mind.
It's all part of this immediate first-person perspective.
And that inherent mindness of experience, that's something worth reflecting on.
Definitely something to ponder.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And we look forward to continuing the conversation in future episodes.